When I pick up a book by Andrew Schelling, the blurb reads, I expect it to be a red clay pot buried in pine needles. I know it will hold within it everything that has occurred in the land surrounding, the flick of the weasel's tail and the cry of the kestrel, the tender lack of friends gone ahead, and the wisdom of many cultures. These poems seem written not by hand, but by heart. Listen to the oldest of books. James Thomas Stevens wrote that about the facts at Dog Tank Spring, published by Dos Madres Press. The blurb is quite perceptive and gives a reader unfamiliar with Andrew Schelling's work a sense of what's to come, and ecopoetics, bioregionalism, awareness of the first people on whose ancestral land he lives and works, and imagery as vivid and grounded as any poet who's ever come out of that great North American tradition. Andrew, joy to have you in the Zoom room.
Wonderful to be here, Paul. Thank you.
The new book is fantastic. I could probably do 3 hours of an interview about it very easily, but certainly we'll go less than that. But some of the poems in the book are 20 years old. So tell us how a book like this comes together.
Well, you could say maybe then that the book has been in the works for 20 years, but not really. In fact, I put this book together in the uh, sort of enforced but also delightful isolation of the COVID era. I had not really thought that I would be pulling a book together, but I decided to. Um, I had two previous books of poetry over about the last maybe 12 years. The first one called From the Arapaho Songbook, which was an explicit attempt to work with my bioregion. I tried to keep the doors open for an international approach to poetry, and so there are some translations in it, lots of references, but that was a book that I really thought of as being grounded in the Southern Rocky Mountain ecosystem. And I also wanted the poems in it to be more or less equivalent in size and emotion. Each one fits as a little kind of squarish or oblong on the page. And they were untitled. And then I thought of the next book, which is called A Possible Bag, as a continuation of that. Though it loosened a bit, some of the poems became more than a page long. Some of the poems began to adopt titles. And I had an idea that a third volume in that sequence would eventually emerge, but that it would have very much the same range of subject matter, but also formally be somewhat close to it. Um, Something happened in the last 3 or 4 years where I began to reevaluate the notion of doing a project and began to think maybe there's some real reason to think about individual poems again, poems that stand on their own and that don't have to link arms with the poems around them or pick up echoes from other poems. This may have been from reading a few poets, including now, not long dead, but dead 15 or 20 years, poet I knew a little bit when I was a young man, Tom Gunn, who was originally a British poet and moved to California. And I picked up selected poems of his that came out several years ago and realized how much I appreciated individual poems. And I also began to think about some of the new media for poetry. And I decided to make this book, The Facts of Dog Tank Spring, move back towards poems that could really stand on their own. So there's a little bit of a shift that happens in this book as I organized it and pulled together material to put the focus more back on independent poems than on a sense that they're all part of a sequence and you need to read them all.
Which is ironic. Tom Gunn was the chief correspondent of Robert Duncan's after the Denise Levertov period. And of course, Duncan comes from a school where thinking of the book rather than the individual poem is the ethos. So,
Absolutely. I mean, that's said so explicitly by those serial poetry people. May go all the way back to Black Jack Spicer describing it, but saying, we realized we were composing by the book, not the poem. At the same time, there's room for the poem. And as I said, a lot of these things, you emerge into interestingly or accidentally. And I've found that more and more of the places I'm able to publish work ask for a poem. They don't want a long sequence.
right. Talk to us about the composition and editing process. Were you doing a series, then it would be maybe chronological, and maybe it's fairly evident if you're writing in terms of a book. But if you're writing in terms of the individual poem, I imagine that the composition process differs as well. Talk to us about how it works for you.
Well, the fact that Dog Tank Spring really has two sections with a couple of interludes in between. So there's four sections, but the main sections are the first section and the last section. The first section really was pulled together while I had been working in that sequential mode. I began to find that the poems themselves, even though they were sequences, they began to rebel a little bit. They wanted to stand on their own a little bit more. They didn't want to sort of fade back into a crowd, but each agitated a little bit for its own identity, which really meant getting a title. So a lot of those poems, I ended up titling them either the first line of the poem or an opening phrase of some sort. I can then move to the final section of the poem where most of those poems were written very specifically as sort of standalone. And it's in that section in particular that I unfortunately or just naturally had to deal with the death of a great number of friends. And so there was quite a few elegies back there. And it really felt that if you're going to write an elegy and make contact with the dead, which is one of the oldest charges of the poet, you don't want to mix it up too badly for the occasion. So the occasion remains with the beloved who has moved on into the, into we don't know what, gone ahead on the journey, I like to say.
It's interesting. As I structured the outline for this interview, I thought near the end, as we talk about all the old friends that you write about, the poem's dedicated to Dale Pennell. So asking about him is an obvious question. But at the end, there was something like, how would you advise someone? What kind of tips would you give someone in terms of writing an elegy? So you started already. Why don't you continue on that thread?
Oh, let's go back to what James Thomas Stevens said: you write it by your heart, not your hand. Yeah, I'm not sure that there's any particular advice. Just as in a way you could say there's no particular rule of thumb how you come through grief, how you watch a friend die, how we're all going to die. There's no particular way. But I would say, probably the best advice is what I spoke to a moment ago, which is not to make the poem too complex. I mean, I know you're a deep reader of Charles Olson, as I have been through my life, and Olson, is known for saying something like a poem should always have 4 or 5 things going on at once. That's probably true in some ways, but it may not be true for an elegy. It may be that with an elegy, you want to stay more clearly defined within the realm of who and what you're talking about.
Do you think that connotes a respect when you keep it clean like that?
Uh, there's respect. There's also, I have a feeling that these poems are talking to the dead. And the one thing that we, have learned probably out of, if you're interested in Buddhist metaphysics, and even if you're not, it is quite possible that the person who's died is going through some uh, very careful evaluations of the life they have lived. And, in a way, what you want to do is help guide them. I have enough Buddhism in myself that I respect very greatly that sense that the living can help guide the dead just as much as the dead can guide us. And so if you're going to take seriously that you will be with the dead person there, you don't want anything particularly distracting in there.
That's really beautiful. That's really, really beautiful. Um, Talk to us about Dale Pennell. What would you say about him to someone who doesn't know his work?
Dale Pennell was a Renaissance man in an age that almost always tries to demand specialization. Dale had so many remarkable capabilities. He's best known as a kind of counterculture historian. His renowned books are a trilogy of medicinal approaches to psychotropic plants that gave him an access to a whole kind of countercultural world. But he also wrote a book on Burning Man. He compiled a book he calls walks, but they're really contested interviews with the great scholar Norman O'Brien, who he used to take walks with. Um, he wrote poetry. Um, he was a great philosopher, a deeply learned scholar outside of any academic context. But I think what I treasure the most is that he found a way of writing that included multiple voices. So when you're reading an essay or a poem or anything of his, um, it's not just one voice trying to tell you something or turn you on to something. It's multiple voices having a conversation about it, but they are not all in harmony. What I love about Dale is they bicker, they argue, they mock, they insult. You don't know if you've walked into a room with a top government specialist or if coyotes lurking in the corner there. I think Dale got a lot of this out of Zen koans and his long Zen practice, but the humor in his work and the multiple voices and the sense, some of us enjoy being unbalanced at times. You know, and Dale's work will do that. You know, it's almost as though it's calculated to not allow him to be a guru of any sort, because no sooner do you think you've got it, then in comes the voice that subverts what you just think you got.
That state of being unbalanced, a lot of people pay good money for that.
Oh, I know. I know.
There are a couple of poems for Dale. There's Old Pal on page 77 and Had the Throats of Birds on the following page, 78. Would you care to read one of those?
Sure. Would you like me to read? Do you like one of them, or would you like both of them?
Whatever you'd like to do. I'm very open, and I've got 3 pages of notes for this interview, and usually a page or a page and a half suffices. So feel free to pace yourself.
Good. I think maybe I'll read both of them because I think I can say something about both of them. They're very different in a way. Old Pal is really an elegy. Old Pal. Didn't think you'd need that detective book again, but sorry I took it without asking. You in a methadone morphine sleep, coral snake, stack of $100 bills on the cover, red rock pinyon juniper background. That's what got me. I just visited Cedar Mesa, old woman listening, listening, drawing long skirts together. Rain never reaches the ground. The granaries, kivas, cliff villages, prickly pear, and now you go shortly, to land of the dead, horned human figures, white and red. Around the next bend, your parting words. That's what I heard, old pal. That was a lovely teaching he gave me there. I was with him 10 days before he died. When I left, he lived in California, I was in Colorado. I had to return to Colorado. When I left, I knew I wouldn't see him again. And I kissed him on top of the head. And as I walked out the door, that's what I heard him say, around the next bend. And that there is a beautiful teaching. Nothing particularly final about it, nothing particularly morose about it, just, a courage, a casualness about it. That's how I'd sort of like to go. It's a short poem, the next one, but I'd like to read it and then say a couple things about it. This may give a little insight. And had the throats of birds. I'm glad this shitty thing didn't stretch out past twilight. Jesus Christ, if we can still help each other, and I think we can, let's.
And it's all in quotations.
That's not my poem, that's Dale's poem.
And yeah, and right. And had the throats of birds as your title. That's an interesting title.
Well, that's probably like me tipping my hand too much as a literary person. The poem, actually, just before he died, Dale dictated these words to his wife and asked her to send them to me. And she sent them, and I thought, this is a ghost dance song. There's a lot in this. This is a ghost dance song. I originally called it Dale Pennell Ghost Dance Song. I tried various things. I realized by putting his name at the end and the quote marks, it'd clue people. The title came from, it's actually the last poem that William Butler Yeats wrote, and it's called Cuchulainn Dies, and the sort of Celtic mythological figure Cuchulainn, having been badly wounded in battle, steps over into a magical land where these shades appear before him and say, it's time to sew your shroud now. And when Cuchulainn looks up from sewing his shroud, he sees the shades around him all had the throats of birds. So this is, really a sense that while Dale was stitching his shroud, these were his words, and after that, he had the throat of birds.
It's fantastic. It's stunning. I hear you read it, and I read it on the page as you're reading the poem, and you very clearly read the lineation as it is. You're using that Olson notion that it should appear on the page as if it is a score for being read, and you read it exactly like that. And yet these are Dale's words, so I wonder about whether you lineated this, or this is how you heard this, and also about your own approach to lineation. How, when I read projective verse and I read it over and over again, it's almost a guide for how to listen for the words in your head and write them down in the way that they appear in your head. So talk to us about lineation, this poem, and your particular stance toward it.
Well, as I said, this was something Dale spoke to his wife, asked her to write it down. She sent it to me as a single line in an email. And I realized that in order to get the intonations that I heard in it, I can't say they're necessarily mine because I also know Dale's intonations, but I can't say they're Dale's because I didn't hear him speak it. but I wanted it spoken in a way where the pacing fit what I thought was happening there, with that, really two little stanzas with that little exclamation, Jesus Christ, in the middle. And maybe the most important typographical element I made a decision on was to lowercase Jesus Christ, knowing what I do of Dale's spiritual life, knowing what I do of standard American speech. So that I felt was a hinge between two statements, really, with that beautiful closing, with the sense, I think, you know, if we can still help each other, and I think anyhow, it's a, sort of a lovely, how's it go? If we can still help each other, and I think we can, let's, that needed to be staggered down the page in order to get an intonation so that it makes sense. As prose, you'd write it out with commas, periods, dashes, colons, semicolons.
Capital J and capital C as well.
Yeah.
And that's your approach. You're writing it down as you hear it in your head. Is that accurate?
Yes, and I would say that a little of that came out of Charles Olson, as you mentioned, projective verse. I certainly knew that, but there was uh, another culture figure of the left coast who I may have learned about from Dale Pendle, but Jaime Dengulo, who I wrote a book about. And Dengulo, I've studied his linguistic and ethnographic work. I've studied it for a long, long time. And as an ethnographer and linguist, he was accustomed to going into the field, making contact with people whose languages had never been written down before, listening, hearing the sounds, writing them down. And later in life, when he became a really quite fabulous both poet and prose writer, that was the way he composed. And I think that became, for me, the sense of things. Listen to how it sounds, and then find an equivalent on the page to how it sounds. And the likelihood is that your reader will come very close to it as you said, a score for reading.
Mm-hmm. And Dangulo has his own links to projective verse, having corresponded with Ezra Pound, who is a big influence on Olson, and having as his secretary Robert Duncan, who, of course, was an Olson compatriot who added some notions about composition by field. So Dangulo was not ignorant of projective verse as well.
Right, or even if he was, I'm very curious about the time that Robert Duncan was his secretary, and they put together Dengulo's great work in the final year of Dengulo's life when he was dying, because that was the time when Robert Duncan first read projective verse. And I think the conversation between these two men, as we know, Robert Duncan was an extraordinarily bright person and an extremely great talker. And Dangulo also had a reputation as a great talker. And, if there had been a tape recorder there for that final year, some of those conversations could have been fascinating. All we've got now is, the sort of husks of manuscripts, but I would love to know how those manuscripts came to be as a collaboration between a old dying Spaniard and a, interesting young San Francisco, Berkeley Renaissance poet in 1949 and 1950.
Mm-hmm. One last thought about lineation is that many of your poems are not left margin justified, but do employ a field approach to lineation. So, how do you employ that? I'm always hearing in my head McClure's criticism of left margin poetry, left margin justified poetry, which he called lawnmower poetry.
That's a good one.
So you stray beyond lawnmower. Maybe it's hedge clipper poetry. I don't know. But talk to us about how you decide to move from that left margin. Is that all a matter of ear, do you think?
I think it's a great deal a matter of ear. I mean, but to carry on McClure's, I like lawnmower poetry. Actually, our word verse means to turn, and it comes from the old Greek and Latin world where farmers would take their plow down to one end of the field and then turn the plow and come back. And to my mind, that's very much left justified poetry, that it is an agricultural poetry. I like to think of myself as rooting around in deeper history than that. Perhaps a little bit more Paleolithic, before you were bound by your cultivated field, bound by the possibilities of your plow and your ox, but where you had to be a little lighter on your feet and a little bit more attentive. That means listening more carefully. That means uh, a kind of mimicry of what's around you. And so, what I've attempted to do with my poems is to mimic not just what I hear, but in some sense, each poem makes its own ecosystem, and then the various poems make a book that is an ecosystem. And I frankly get bored by too much left-hand margin. That seems to be one of the despotic moves that have been brought about by the computer. Um, the typewriter was a lot easier to wildly venture across. And, for a number of years, I was friends with the poet Larry Eidner, who used a typewriter and who had a, cerebral palsy from birth, and was quite, um, you know, uh, I don't know how to say it. He had to find a way of working with the typewriter that was not a conventional way. And when I would watch him type, it was remarkable to see how he used the entire page to fit his body and mind. And I think, we lose something if we get too far away from the page. The computer is, you can adjust it and set it up so you can do all the things that a typewriter did, but few people think of that. And so, my effort is to reproduce a kind of living, or, people have talked about Michael McClure's poetry as being biomorphic. I'd like my poetry also to be biomorphic much more than, virtual morphic.
A word that you just invented. Um, Page 2, the hermeneutical task. How about reading that one and talking about it? Because this will give us more of your sense, or it might give us more of your sense. It might just create more questions. Feel free.
The hermeneutical task. When the sign says, "Don't go past the sign," something's up there. Stick figure with horns, mountain sheep floating on rock face. Spirals catch the slow rotation of stars if you sit and watch long enough. Each cairn wavers in sunlight, its sentinel lizard a flash of blue. I think the two kestrel CB spotted chasing the raven into vertically slashed shadow. We don't have enough wilderness. There's no way to figure why the slab got so many spindly serpents, or night, sky, initiative, rivers. Land is alive. Here, lizard, lizard, blue throat, the lonesome song of the canyon wren. In an oral tradition, the only way to achieve the hermeneutical task of understanding a story is to perform it.
A hype one.
A Haibun, yeah, yep, exactly. Or an exploded Haibun or something, yeah.
Yeah, those hype one have a tendency to do that sometimes, don't they? Outstanding. I love, it's everybody's feeling when the sign says don't go past the sign. you know, I got to stop myself when I'm with Ella, my 8-year-old daughter, and it's like, no, you got to be an example. You can't just follow your probably your lowest impulse. But going back to the oral tradition and the notion here, it's Chaco Canyon. This
Yeah.
is the
Mhm.
scene of it. Going over this again, very strong sense of where we are in the world. The here and now is very much present in this. So there's a Buddhism in there. There's a bioregionalism in there. There's an homage to the first people in there. So much of what that blurb said and what we love about your work is present in, I believe that's the very first, no, it's the second poem in the book. So, but it's very close. Yeah.
And of course, there's a little joke in there too. I mean, since hermeneutics are all about signs, it's wonderful to have a sign that says "Don't go past the sign." And then, what is the hermeneutics of going past a sign that says "Don't go past the sign"?
Yeah. Another late friend was Jack Collim, and on page 5, there's a poem called 13 Notebooks, and he comes up later in the poem One Question on page 11. And then I think there's at least one more reference to him. I think maybe just a line, read Jack Collim's poetry, but maybe starting with 13 Notebooks, because that again gets back to um, a little bit of your process. And I think that'd be interesting to hear.
Sure. Yeah, and then we can talk a little bit about Jack Collim. So 13 Notebooks, this is dated 2 July 2017, 2nd July 2017. 13 notebooks have passed since I worked at this poem. A friend with ice blue eyes once called the poem an archetype. What did he mean? Many tracks twist through its chirps and clefts. That's one thought. It has portals and byways, another. Now Jack Collim has gone straight through. Out west, you still hear talk of the land of the dead, gullies and animal tracks. The next life's not certain, Jack. You are now on your own, compadre.
This goes back to a lesson that you gave at West Auburn High School in the year 2000 when you visited Auburn, Washington via SPLAB, which was at the time the spoken word lab that Danica Dinsmore and I co-founded. And because of her friendship with you and Ann Waldman, we had the good fortune of you visiting at that time. And one of the tips you gave the high schoolers was always carry a pocket notebook with you. And of course, I was taking notes as I often do, and I'm like, I'm on that one. And I think I've gone through many, many, many pocket notebooks, um, and they're beautiful, really potent things to have. I've been harvesting my American sentences from these pocket notebooks, and it's not easy work to go over the very intimate details of your own life. So they're pretty powerful little things if you do them right, aren't they?
Oh, very much. Yeah, yeah. I mean, notebooks are, in a way, my mode of composition. Most of my poems, many of my translations, all my essays, um, have elements that come out of my notebooks. Very often they start in the notebooks. I try to carry a notebook all the time. And the great thing about a notebook is it works just as well on the side of a mountain as on a bus or in a cafe. Um, Low technology. You need a pen or a pencil, and you need some sort of sheaf of paper that's held together enough that you can kind of, bang it around a bit, throw it in and out of a pocket or a backpack or, you know, any of that sort of thing. Yeah.
And Jack Collim. And again, I hear this poem in a new way after hearing you talk about elegies, helping to guide the soul in the afterlife. And the next life's not certain, Jack. You are now on your own, compadre, which is italicized, oddly enough. Um, Tell us about Tell us about Jack Collim, your colleague at Naropa for many years.
Yeah, Jack was a dear friend, and I should also, mention there's a poem for Anselm Hollow in here, but I had been living through the 1980s in the Bay Area, and poetry was really exciting in the Bay Area. It was not only exciting, but it felt dicey and conflicted and up for grabs. And there were poetry wars, and there were bitter rivalries, and there were takeovers of reading series and takeovers of journals. And it sort of felt like I'd been living in one of the more exciting historical periods that I could imagine. But also a little bit like I was living in a revolutionary war zone with many separatist militias, each with their own agenda. When I moved to Colorado and met Jack and Anselm, what I really have to say about the two of them is they re-taught me how much fun it is to write poetry. It doesn't have to be your life on the line all the time. It's just fun. And Jack, particularly because he was also renowned for the work he did, especially with school children. Jack, pioneered all sorts of teaching in other communities, but he was so good with children. He wrote several books on teaching poetry to children. And, he was really fun with it. He was great at that. I tried it a few times. I didn't have quite the constitution Jack did, but Jack, whenever you got together with him, he always had a pad of paper and a pen, and you were doing pass around poems, as he called them, sort of collaborations. And, he loved forms, he loved non-forms. He had one of the great senses of humor. I think up until very recently, every school child, say elementary public school child in Colorado, probably knew Jack Collim as Jack, who had come into their classroom and taught them poetry. My daughter, growing up in Boulder, had him come into the classroom probably every year for 4 or 5 years. And now you have to realize when I got to Colorado and started teaching at the Jack Kerouac School at Naropa, Jack was already there. My daughter was 2.5. Then my daughter saw Jack Collim come into her class repeatedly, or saw Jack come into class. And it wasn't until my daughter was grown up in a conversation I discovered she still thought Jack Collim was Jack Kerouac because he was the only Jack she saw around the school called the Jack Kerouac School. Well, Jack would have loved that. He was also an expert bird watcher. So another of the poems in this to Jack, speaks about birds because Jack, knew a great deal about birding and went out regularly and, was my go-to guy when I needed for, Jack, I heard a bird call. It sounds something like this. And I'd put it to him. Jack was in the stratosphere as far as birders go. He was, as good as anybody.
How about one question on page 11?
One question: where does a book begin? Does it begin the last 1,000 years? Paper, parchment, sheep's hide, palm leaf, bamboo. It changes what you think of the pictograph to see frog as a clan sign, horned figure pecked into desert varnish. It was cold the night Jack Collim died. We had a dream. We were chipping acrostics into pre-Cambrian rock.
What I find really fascinating about that is that we had a dream. It's not I had a dream. I had a weird dream last night. Um, and was he in your dream the night he died?
He was in my dream shortly afterwards, and we were chipping acrostics into rock. Now, I have to say that one of Jack's favorite modes of writing was to do acrostics. That was something he gave his students all the time. And Jack has many, many published acrostics. And, the fact that we were doing acrostics into the rock like the petroglyphs, not my dream, had to be our dream.
That's really potent. That's really beautiful. I mean, just that little switch or twist, I find it fascinating. Was that natural? I mean, did you think coming into that line, no, it's got to be, I mean, immediately? Do you remember the moment of composition?
I don't. No, I can't. It probably had to be there because it seems um, too interesting for my conscious mind to have arrived at afterwards through editing or something.
Yeah, fantastic. Um, The Hand That Shapes the Mind is a poem in which matters of eco-poetics again and spirit are raised. It's on page 18. Um, how does spirit fare in poetry in 2021 in the wake of movements that seem to me to be quite materialistic and maybe that even see matters of spirit or soul as anachronistic? Um, to discover, recover the mind's actual shape is a line from an Arapaho songbook. But how does poetry allow a practitioner or a listener to discover or recover their mind's actual shape? Maybe you can, I don't know if reading the poem first or having the conversation first, what would be best? Maybe reading the poem on page 18. Um, if that,
Good. I will do that at your prompting so I can remember the poem. Sure. Um, and you had asked a little, or you had mentioned that it was, again, a little bit of an ecological poem, and it may be, but in a kind of ecology of the spirit. And I'm slightly suspicious about going too deeply into some of the hidden little tricks or secrets in this poem, but I'll read it and we can think about the spirit a bit. Um, but maybe so it doesn't go past too fast. In a sense of evolution, how we got to this particular hand that we humans, or most of us humans, have with the opposable thumb, the 5 digits, the ability to do, such minute, spectacular things with it, and how that co-evolved with a mind so that we have really a two-way street. The hand shapes the mind as much as the mind shapes the hand. But to be properly ecological here or evolutionary, the environment is shaping both of them. So the hand that shapes the mind. The hand that shapes the mind, clay or written word, is subject to accident and time. To find it, you must find the meander. They say things too pure or lines that go straight permit troublesome spirits a place to cling. The good teacup has a flaw. It wobbles. The avant-garde continues with its own purity. An exotic, not very hardy species survives in greenhouse environments, academia, the so-called art world, the gallery ghettos. Once set outside, it tends to shrivel and die. Who can maintain that level of purity? On the phone, a message, how many years old? I intend to keep it, my dead father's voice. It may help me imagine a new kuksu, a place in the future, the watershed no longer imperiled, a bird mask to cover, I like to think sheepishly disclose, a lifetime of error, one accidental imprint in the design, a crack in the pot where the spirit escapes.
the um, the avant-garde, the purity of that, I'm immediately drawn back to your comment about San Francisco's poetry scene in the '80s. So I'm sure there are hints of that in there. Um, it's interesting. This goes a little differently than the elegy because uh, say things too pure or lines that go straight permit troublesome spirits a place to cling. Maybe that's part of what Olson was getting at, or maybe it's coming from a similar kind of impetus.
Oh, sure. And in fact, in there, if anybody has studied a little bit of Japanese aesthetics, whether it's poetry or tea ceremony or pottery or anything, the one of the gifts that Japan has given to the world, besides haiku and haibuan, but one of the gifts is an affection for things that are a little bit old, a little bit worn out, a little bit wobbly, a little bit cracked, a little bit imperfect. Um, it's a marvelous aesthetic, and it has really opened us to what life is really like. As I say in that poem, a lifetime of error, one accidental imprint in the design. And in fact, what's treasured in Japanese aesthetics is often that accidental imprint. There's a little bit of a wobble to the teacup. There's a little bit of sprung rhythm in the poem. And we can look at our lives being so full of failures and errors and get really down about it. But in a way, this poem is trying to tease at the edge that actually this is our spirit. We make mistakes. We have errors. If we were too pure, watch out for those guys.
And that suggests that the reason we're here is to build a soul, and these quote unquote errors or mistakes or accidents are rerouting opportunities, heading us in the direction that the cunning artificer might have us head in.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure behind a little bit of that poem, two things I've thought about a long time is William Blake's "The Body is Inside the Soul,"
Right.
which sort of tips a lot of metaphysics, or inverts it, turns it inside out. But it also makes us think, the soul isn't some Cartesian, like little animated thing that's inside this body, but it's really an ecological vision in a way. And then also very specifically, since we've talked about Robert Duncan, I think somewhere writes that the soul is the shape of a lifetime. And to me, that really is, we don't really know what a soul will be until a lifetime is ended. And then we see, in a sense, this is a completed being. This is what we can understand as as the soul, the spirit. I use those words a little bit interchangeably. I mean, they're metaphysically tricky words, and I don't want to get pinned to definitions or particular metaphysics or religious systems, but I think they're very serviceable words for us if we stay loose about using them.
People don't change; they only stand more revealed. I likewise, as also would have it. Um, but in our culture, maybe it's the weight of all this mechanistic thinking, this identity and separation. But the notions of soul in poetry seem archaic in many ways. I mean, I don't think of it as that. I think the reason we're here is to build a soul, and poetry is one of the vehicles to do that. But in contemporary culture, contemporary poetry culture especially, matters of soul and spirit are I don't know, frowned upon, hackneyed. What word would you use?
We've talked about things about things like this a little bit before, and I think my attitude is I'm quite okay having a beer with an atheist. Let's bring them into the conversation. If I'm afraid of what they say, I can't have too much conviction around my use of words like that.
Right. And it's a short ride from there to beating someone up with an American flagpole, as was done at the Capitol riot on January 6th. So I hear what you're saying about flexibility or negative capability or being open minded. Um, now, when I read this next poem that I'd like to talk about, which is on page 23, why, why I visit the Camel Festival. Um, And I remember seeing you at least one AWP, the one here in Seattle, as a matter of fact. The AWP is a conference, and who knows what the future of it's going to be. But for those who aren't, you know, aware of AWP, it's this gigantic annual convention for writers, for poets and writers. 16,000 writers and poets descend on a city. It's a self promotion fest that you've never seen the likes of. It's an extraordinary event. People first, when they encounter you, they first look down at your chest to see what your name tag says to find out if you're important or not. And then if you're not, they can go on to the next chest. It's an amazing experience that I don't really ever need to have again. However, you at the Minneapolis AWP writing this poem, I think is just fantastic. So, could you set the scene for us and read it, or do you just want to read it, or what do you feel about that?
Well, I'll read it, but I'll add a statement or two. Not only do all these writers descend on a city, but it all takes place in a gigantic convention center. These are the kind of centers where you have auto shows and things like that. It's a gigantic convention center. The ones that I've seen have been quite up to date and contemporary and awfully airless, kind of brutalist architecture. um, and when I after when I went to Minneapolis for it, I made a good decision. I decided instead of staying at one of the overpriced convention hotels attached to the center, I would deliberately choose a place to stay that was on the other side of the city for a few reasons. One is I had to walk all the way, 3 or 4 miles in order to get to it. That allowed me a little bit of a sense of the city, but it also meant when I got thoroughly fatigued by the airlessness of the event itself, if I went back to take a nap, I wasn't tempted to, hit an elevator button and go downstairs and rejoin the fray.
And did you go over the bridge that has John Ashbery's poem?
Oh, I don't know the John Ashbery poem. I went over a bridge at least, yeah, twice a day to and from, yeah, over the Mississippi up high in the Mississippi. Sure. Why I visit the Camel Festival. One neighbor against expectation keeps a Bactrian camel in a corral, two shaggy dark humps with a palomino. I'd like to visit the Mongolia Camel Festival. It's got soldiers, monks, merchants, camel breeders, but instead go to the associated writing programs. The Camel Fair has races, music, dance. Women and men show up in costume and compete for attention, which sounds like the AWP. Turn anywhere, there's stamping and snorting, wheels, grunts. Merchants haul in their loads. They hand out books, brochures, buttons with tough gnomic verse. People have traveled from Louisiana, Oklahoma, Oregon, far off Singapore, New York. In the convention hall, water's scarce. Hardly any vegetation, just like the Asiatic steppes. The tribes stamp noisily here. They snort with impatience. Hoofs clop in the corridors. Imagine your fingers tangled in camel hair. It smells smoky and fierce.
I love that poem reading it, but hearing you, it just adds a whole nother dimension. I mean, you're a brilliant reader of your work. You're reading the poems as they should be read. Obviously, they're your poems. But hearing is, in the end, you're not sure which event you're talking about necessarily.
No, it may be going back way. It may be another dream crossover. Yeah.
It's not just your poem, it's your poem and the Campbell's poem.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh my God. I don't know. There's so much more to talk about, Andrew. The Arapaho verb illustrates the notion of indigenous languages as roadmaps for bioregions. We may have talked before about that. Another elegy is Corinne Schelling. Is that your mom?
Yeah, that was my mother. Yeah.
Yeah, and so your mom. There's a poem that alludes to your mom. It's a beautiful poem. There's the poem Ulla, which I remember seeing as a broadside before the book came out, and or maybe just a little beautiful hand lettered card or something that you sent us, which is very sweet to get that. And the fact that you're referring to owls in that poem, and my daughter has had this owl puppet since she was since she was born, and the fact that I do a very good crow impression. There go the crows in their evening migration as I speak. That is an incredibly beautiful poem. um, there's the holy shit raga. um, all of this stuff would be rich for discussion, but I'm afraid we're already at just about an hour, and so I'm going to try and refine this to maybe just a couple potent last parts. One of them is the poem "In Mount Blanca with Ute Creek at Dawn." It reads like an essay, in part like a collage, very much a bioregional document. It's very effective. Can you tell us about the inspiration for this poem and its form? A couple of really interesting notes to me. You write, where Mount Blanca sits was Mexico until 1848. Also, letting your mind or mouth wander regarding religious matters may prove dangerous. Showing off is also perilous. I mean, about things you know or your skill in mountains. The gods are always watching for bright, flamboyant figures to carry off.
Sure. I certainly won't read that. I think that may take 10 minutes to read, but that came about because a curator at the Denver Art Museum uh, wanted an evening in which there was not really so much poetry as poets. And I was asked to round up a few other poets. We went down to the art museum and we were all asked to write something on one piece in their collection. And then for one of their monthly open Friday nights, they have free Friday nights with all sorts of performers and events going on, and open bar, or cash bars and various things. Very lively scene, but people were permitted to check out a poet. That was one of the things you could do. You could go up to a table and say, I want this poet. And so then as the poet, I would, or one of my compatriots would take several people down to the artwork that we had written off of and read our poem in front of it. And when I did that with this, there was actually quite a crowd gathered, 40 or 50 people. This is a very marvelous painting, Mount Blanca with Ute Creek at Dawn, by a painter who's, I think, just slightly older than me, within a year of my age, Stephen Hannock. And it's a large painting in the mode of, the sort of ecstatic or sublime of Bierstadt or Thomas Moran, who famously painted mountains or mountain scenes in the Rocky Mountain West. Stephen Haneke did this with a mountain that I know very well from having been around it quite a bit, called Mount Blanca, which turns out to be the easternmost mountain in the Navajo cosmography. But his painting, from a bit of a distance, looks like it's right in the tradition of Bierstadt and Moran, these 19th century landscape painters. Then you get up close and you see that there are stencils on the painting, there are funny things written, there are even x-rays of his wife's lungs, who was fighting cancer at the time. There are stencils of Dr. Seuss characters. There are funny things written all over some of the climbing routes, some of the, the Denver Broncos show up. The New England Patriots coach Bill Belichick's name is written in there somehow. and little things were pasted on. And so what I wanted to do with this poem was to make something that looked on the outside like it could be just a painting of a mountain, but once you got in, it was complicated by all sorts of material, and also gave me an opportunity to make a few jokes about my real envy of visual artists, even painters who can um, like a Jasper Johns nailing a paintbrush to his canvas, or a Pablo Picasso and Juan Gris, pasting newspaper, bits of newspaper, or in the modern era, you can stencil on Dr. Seuss images or x-rays of your loved spouse or something. There's an envy that we writers have because all we have is words to work with. So that kind of came up as a bit of a joke within it, but I wanted to see how far I could stretch the words and interact with a painting and also a landscape that I know quite well.
Obviously, that comes through. The love of it, the awareness of it, the history of it is really important to know. Um, I mean, just the last 4 years in this country, how ignorant the dialogue has become because of the complete lack of education. The almost near complete ignorance, as Morris Berman warned us about 30 or so years ago, and others have been warning us about for a long time. And I I'm very careful not to say it can't get any worse because we've seen just how bad the dialogue can get, the discourse can get. Um, how about you choosing a poem that you'd like to leave us with? Because of the other elegies, Christina Lofton is eulogized, Bobby Louise Hawkins, who I met at Naropa and had a good experience with. You mentioned Ansem Hollow. Um, how would you like to end this?
Well, rather than ending with a actual eulogy, I think maybe what I will do is pick another poem. Maybe let's call this bioregional. This is a local poem to me, as local as it can get. This is actually about my next door neighbors, these two little girls. This is called Riddlers, Rogues, and Children. For several days, I've been reading about secret languages. The author calls them dark tongues. Speakers hide mysteries inside what they speak. There's a break in the storm, so I set off for the mailbox. Two neighbor girls bounce down on bicycles. "This is Larkspur," says one, ditching her wheels. "Silver lupin, kinnikinick," she swipes her hand at the leaves. "And her name is Etalock," laughs the other. In law or the English department, we call it jargon. Vulgate or cant when swapped on the street. In England, someone called it bog Latin. Etalock, of course, the name spoken backwards, same thing as dog. Colette returns to her bike. In England, at Crossroads, people heard ghost words. They called it peddler's French. But children do it better than rogues, riddlers, vagabonds, priests. So Aehipos, that's Eihpos. So Aehipos for you. Let's look at that green leaf again. Its name a fiddler's trick. Forward is backwards. There's a bear in the berry. He'll set you a riddle. Kinnikinick.
What a beautiful, what a beautiful, rich book this is. One can go to it over and over and over again and get so much out of it. Um, uh, it may be the best book you've ever done. To see how your work, you know, progresses is just a beautiful thing. I think you're onto something with the method that you've employed, and it's really been an honor and delight to be able to have this access to your process and to your work and to have this document for it. You've been a teacher to me, and I've learned so much, and it's been a real joy to know you, to be able to read this book with the knowledge that we'd be having this chat, and to have this time with you. So thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Paul, and for your questions, very perceptive questions. It's good to know that there's a reader out there and somebody who's embedded in the tradition and able to ask the right questions and get into craft and get into, a sense of a book as a book and not just hit on a couple of, popular poems or something. I appreciate your work. Thank you, Paul.